In this video, we're going to be making a Lazy Susan with walnut and epoxy. Actually, I'm going to build 3 of them because I want to actually build some bigger things a little bit later, and it seems wise to start with a couple of smaller projects with epoxy because I've never used it before. We start off with a live edge piece of walnut, a couple of them actually, and the first thing we have to do is clean them up. We're just getting off all those big chunks of bark because we need a nice clean place for the epoxy to be able to bond to. So just using chisels and picks and whatever other tools work, we clean off as much of the outside bark, the big pieces, as we can. For all the knots and the little cracks, you've got to clean those out really well as well, because the epoxy that you pour in there needs to be able to adhere to a solid piece of wood, and you don't want them popping off later. Once the majority of the bark is off, I've taken it outside and clamped it to my basketball pole here, and just using my angle grinder with a wire wheel, I'm cleaning up all the little bits of bark that are left over. All that brown stuff is actually pretty soft wood, so I need to get it down to that bare wood so that, again, the epoxy has a really good place to bond to. And that gives us that nice clean edge now. Now we've got to build the molds for the Lazy Susans. These are going to wind up being about 14 or 15 inches in diameter, so I'm actually making a 16-inch mold here for them to go into so that I can trim them down to their final size later. We start off with a 16-inch square, and then using my circle cutting jig on my bandsaw, I can cut a circle for the mold for the Lazy Susan. Using that scrap piece of cutoff, I can visualize what the Lazy Susan's going to look like. And once I kind of see, I can draw the circle so I know where to cut the walnut. And I do that with just my jigsaw. I actually cut just inside the lines here to make it a little bit smaller so that there's a little bit of wiggle room inside of the mold. Then just making sure they fit and trying to remember which orientation I had the pieces in. There we go. Just so that we can see how they're going to fit inside the mold once it's done. So for an edging for this, I'm actually going to use lawn garden edging, the stuff you put in the ground to stop weeds from spreading from one area to another or to define a space. But it's reasonably flexible, and epoxy, it turns out, doesn't really stick to it, as we'll see in a little bit. So I thought it was a pretty good material to use for this. We screw in all the way around the base so it's nice and tight to the mold, and then we're going to add some caulking in a moment to make it nice and watertight or epoxy tight. To seal up where the 2 pieces came together, I'm just using some tuck tape, and I put one piece directly over it, and then I layer a couple more pieces on each side and then back in the middle again, just again to make sure it's epoxy tight. And then we're going to use some caulking to go around the perimeter of the whole thing to make a nice seal so nothing can leak out, or at least that's the plan. I probably put more in here than I really needed to, but since I've never worked with epoxy before, I thought more is probably better than less. So I'm using ice cast epoxy here. I don't have any reason for using it other than what was available to me where I could buy this kind of stuff from. It's a 2-part epoxy, so 2 parts A, 1 part B. And then you have to thoroughly mix this stuff together. I'm going to add some dye in here in a moment. There it goes. And then you have to give the things a really thorough mix, making sure you're scraping the sides of your container as you're going. I bought one of those mixing paddle things from Amazon. I don't know if it really helps or not, but it made me feel like it did. And I think I got a pretty thorough mix with it. I'll leave a link in the description below to the ones that I got. The other thing I used was this mold release, which I spray onto the form. I didn't do it here. I took it outside and did it because I didn't want to get it on any of the pieces or in the epoxy or anything like that. And then I finally get to actually do the epoxy pour itself. I've seen a bunch of people do this on YouTube. It always looks pretty satisfying, and I got to admit this was kind of fun to do, kind of see how everything is coming together. Now, I didn't mix enough in my first go around to fill this one up, so I had to come back and to mix another batch and pour it in as well. I have, this is only about an inch thick in total, so I can pour the whole thing at once, which was kind of nice. Depending on the thickness of what you're doing, you can't pour it all at once. Sometimes you have to pour it in layers. And as the epoxy begins to set up, it produces bubbles, and you have to come back and pop those with a blowtorch or a heat gun. So then I'm just going to remove, this is a couple of days later, I'm going to remove that mold around the outside. And here I thought everything was going swimmingly. And when you see this pop off, it's like, oh, that looks like everything just worked out fine, didn't it? Well, just hang on for 1 second. I try to get the melamine off here, or the melamine, depending on how you like to pronounce it. I take an X-Acto knife and I cut around the edge just to break the seal that the caulking has, because it won't just kind of come apart on its own. You have to kind of cut through it. But no problem, we'll just cut through that and this thing will pop off just like I've seen it do in every YouTube video and tutorial that I've ever watched. If this was a SpongeBob SquarePants episode, you would see 3 hours later flash up across the screen. But this is not. This is an epoxy video, and this is where things started to go horribly wrong. Since then, I've made one more Lazy Susan, and it popped off no problem. I'm 99% sure the problem was that I did not let the mold release dry long enough before pouring the epoxy in. The one that I did after this, the one that I've done since this, the melamine just popped off once I stuck that little wedge in there. I cut the epoxy, stuck the wedge in, and it just popped off. But that wasn't the case here, and it wasn't the case for any of the 3 that I had done this way. I just didn't wait long enough for the mold release to dry to allow it just to pop off. So I work away and I chip the melamine off as best that I can, trying to get as much of it as I possibly can before I switch to my hand planer, and then I just begin to work at it and get it down to the actual epoxy and wood. This was rather disappointing, I ain't gonna lie, but it turned out okay in the end. It was just a process to get there. Don't think I'm going to be reusing that particular piece of melamine. Next, we're going to cut this down to its final dimension, so I'm just finding where the approximate center of this is. I'm going to drill a little hole and stick a nail in there. This time I'm going to use my table saw circle cutting jig. My bandsaw is just a tiny little piddly thing that can't cut through much more than melamine, and it won't cut through this walnut easily, so I am using my table saw one. Now you'll notice here I'm wearing gloves, and as someone astutely pointed out in one of my last videos, that you shouldn't wear gloves while you're working at a table saw, and they're 100% correct. And this is a case of do as I say and not as I do. As you can see, it makes a nice circle. And then off we go to the next step, which is cutting the bases for these 3 Lazy Susans. So again, we're just finding the center, and we're going to use our table saw circle jig again to cut them down to the appropriate size so that they'll accommodate the Lazy Susan hardware. Sanding and finishing. I'm not going to talk too much about what I've done here. Instead, what I'll do is leave a link in the description below to Cam at Blacktail Studios, to a video he did on how to finish. He does tables, but the same process applies here, and he does a really good job of explaining it all and walking you through step by step, so I'll leave a link for that in the description below. The only thing I'll say is I'm using the sandpaper here that you get from the big box stores, which is what I've always used. And if you've watched any number of woodworking YouTube videos, you see all the guys say you got to get the good stuff, forget the stuff at the box stores. And I was one of those guys like, how much of a difference could it possibly make? Well, I went out and I got some, and I feel like an idiot for not having got it sooner. It makes such a difference. I'm leaving a link in the description below to the stuff that I got. It's the 3M Cubitron or Cubics or something like that. But it makes sanding go so much faster and gives you such a quality finish. Even with my cheap little orbital palm sander there, it's well worth the money. Next, we're going to attach the hardware, and as you can see, I'm just marking for the 4 corners where I need to screw this to it, and then a 5th hole, which I'll drill right through the base, which will allow me to attach it to the top once the hardware is attached to the base. You'll see what I mean in a moment. Then we just drill those, and I've got a little bit of tape on the drill there just to make sure I don't go too far. And then I'm just going over the drill press to cut that through hole, which will allow me to mount this to the bottom side of the top of the Lazy Susan. You'll see what I mean in a moment. To center this on the Lazy Susan itself, I made this little popsicle sticky thing, and it's the same diameter as the inside diameter of the hardware. And when I stick the nail back in the hole I used to cut the Lazy Susan itself, all I have to do is spin that around a couple times, and it forces the hardware into the center of the board. It worked out really well, and everything lined up perfectly. Then we're just marking the holes that we'll need to drill to attach the top to the hardware. And again, we drill them and put the tape on there to make sure we don't go too far. Then we're going to apply our finish. We're using Osmo 3043, 4033. I can't remember which way that goes. Nonetheless, it's covered in the Blacktail Studios video, so I won't get into too much of that here, but it does give you a really nice finish. So now we're going to attach the hardware to the base plate first, just with 4 screws. So we've just lined it up with our pre-drilled holes and attach the screws to that. And now we'll attach it to the Lazy Susan part itself. And to do that, we've got the back side here of the Lazy Susan. And we're going to use that hole that we drilled all the way through, and we're going to line that up with the holes on the hardware. And then we're going to line both of those up with the holes that we pre-drilled into the Lazy Susan itself. And then we can insert a screw through that hole to attach the hardware to the bottom of the Lazy Susan. If I didn't explain that okay, just watch the pictures. I think it kind of makes sense. And that's it. That's one Lazy Susan. As I said, I made 3 of these, and they all turned out pretty well, I thought. Thanks very much for watching, and have a great day.